The stars had always been silent, at least that's what everyone on Earth used to think. For centuries, humans looked up at the night sky and wondered if anyone was out there. Then one day someone answered. It wasn't with a message of peace or a friendly hello. It was a summons. A massive ship, smooth, silver, and shaped like a coiled serpent, appeared in orbit over Earth without warning. No weapons fired, no alarms blared. It just hovered. Then came the voice, calm and echoing through every communication channel on the planet, from military satellites to kitchen radios. The Galactic Concord requests the presence of a human delegation at the Citadel of Accord. You are now recognized as a spacefaring species. Compliance is expected. That last part, compliance is expected, sent a chill through every government on Earth. But after decades of near-constant conflict, humanity had finally learned to work together. The United Earth Council, formed just 10 years earlier after the last global crisis, quickly assembled a small team. They weren't soldiers or politicians in the old sense. They were scientists, diplomats, engineers, people who understood both technology and human nature. Among them was a quiet woman who'd once taught history at a university before volunteering for off-world missions. She wasn't chosen for her title, but for her clarity of thought. Their ship, the Resolute, was modest by galactic standards, patched together from recycled orbital stations and powered by a salvaged alien drive found buried under Martian ice. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. And it carried something the Concord didn't expect. Humility. Yes, but also pride. Not the arrogant kind, but the kind that comes from surviving against the odds. The journey to Proxima Centauri took 3 weeks. Inside the Resolute, the team prepared. They studied everything they could about the Concord, its laws, its history, its member species. What they found was impressive and unsettling. The Concord had existed for over 2,000 years. It kept peace across hundreds of star systems. No major wars, no piracy, no resource wars. On paper, it was a utopia, but the more they read, the more questions they had. Every new species that joined the Concord seemed to fade. Their languages stopped evolving. Their art became standardized. Their military forces were integrated and never seen again. Officially, it was called harmonization. Unofficially, it sounded like erasure. Still, Earth had no choice but to go. Refusing the summons could be seen as an act of aggression, and humanity wasn't ready for war, not with an empire that spanned galaxies. When they arrived at the Citadel of Accord, they were awestruck. The structure wasn't built, it was grown. Twisting spires of living metal spiraled around a central core, glowing with soft blue light. Ships from dozens of species drifted in perfect formation, like dancers in a silent ballet. Everything was orderly, clean, controlled. They were escorted through shimmering corridors by tall, insect-like beings with gentle voices and too many eyes. No one shouted. No one argued. It felt peaceful but also empty, like a museum where nothing was allowed to change. Then came the council chamber. It was vast, circular, and filled with representatives from over 200 species. Some floated in tanks of liquid. Others stood on mechanical limbs. A few didn't have bodies at all, just hovering orbs of light. At the center sat the High Arbiter, an ancient being from the Velnari species, its skin like polished stone, voice like wind through canyon walls. The Arbiter spoke slowly, as if addressing children. "You have reached the stars," it said. "This is commendable. But space is not a playground. It is a shared responsibility. To ensure harmony, all emerging species must accept the Concord protocols." Then came the terms. Earth would surrender control of all colonies beyond the moon. Human military vessels would be decommissioned or handed over. All scientific research would be reviewed by Concord oversight. Cultural broadcast would be filtered to prevent destabilizing ideas. And within 50 years, humanity would fully integrate, adopting Concord law, language standards, and social norms. In short, Earth could keep its planet, but it would lose its voice. The Arbiter paused, expecting gratitude. After all, this was how it had always been done. Every species before them had accepted. Some hesitated, yes, but in the end they bowed. Survival was smarter than pride, but the humans didn't bow. They stood quietly, listening. No one interrupted. No one argued. But their silence wasn't submission, it was processing. The woman who once taught history thought of every revolution, every protest, every time humans had chosen freedom over comfort. She remembered the stories of people who hid books during censorship, who whispered truths in dark rooms, who rebuilt cities from rubble. Earth hadn't survived ice ages, plagues, and world wars just to hand over its future without a word. The engineer beside her thought of the Martian drive, the one they'd reverse-engineered not to conquer, but to explore. They'd shared the schematics with every nation on Earth, even former enemies. That was humanity's way. Messy, slow, sometimes foolish, but always reaching. The scientist remembered how, just a decade ago, Earth had nearly torn itself apart over water and energy. But instead of fighting to the end, they'd chosen to build, together. That choice hadn't been easy, but it had been theirs. Now, someone else wanted to take that choice away. The High Arbiter tilted its head, sensing something unusual. "You will comply," it said, not as a question but as a fact. The human delegation exchanged glances, not with fear but with understanding. They hadn't come here to beg for a seat at the table. They'd come to see if the table was worth sitting at. And in that moment, something shifted, not just for them, but for the entire galaxy. Because for the first time in 2,000 years, a species looked the Concord in the eye, and didn't say yes, they didn't say no yet either. Not out loud, but the thought was there, growing like a seed in dry soil, and seeds given time can crack stone. As they were led back to their ship, the corridors felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore, it was tense. The other species watched them, not with curiosity, but with something like hope, or fear. Maybe both. Back aboard the Resolute, the air was thick with unspoken words. No one celebrated. No one panicked. They just sat in the dim light of the cabin, staring at the stars outside the viewport. One of them finally spoke, voice low. "They think we're like the others," another nodded. "They don't understand us. Do we even understand ourselves?" Someone else asked. The woman who taught history smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the point. We're still figuring it out, and that's our right." Outside, the citadel of Accord glowed like a perfect jewel, beautiful, unchanging, and utterly still. But inside the small human ship, something was stirring. Not anger, not arrogance, just a quiet, stubborn truth. We are not yours to shape. And that simple thought, carried in the hearts of a handful of humans, light years from home, would soon shake the galaxy to its core. Back aboard the Resolute, the silence was heavier than space itself. No one spoke at first. They just floated in the dim glow of the cabin lights, staring at the floor, the walls, or out the viewport at the distant gleam of the citadel. It wasn't fear they felt. It was something deeper. Like standing at the edge of a cliff knowing you can't step back but not sure if you're ready to jump. One of them finally broke the quiet. "They didn't ask what we wanted," they said, voice rough. "They just told us what we'd get." Another nodded slowly. "It's not an offer. It's a script. And we're supposed to read our lines and bow at the end." They gathered around the main table, where a holographic display still showed the Concord's terms, neat, clean, color-coded. "Surrender your colonies. Disarm your ships. Submit your culture. Accept your place." The words looked polite, but the meaning was clear. You don't get to decide who you become. Then someone pulled up old Earth archives. Not the polished history books, but raw footage, grainy videos from centuries past. A crowd marching with handmade signs, a woman singing in a bombed-out street, a child planting a seed in cracked earth after a war. They watched scenes of people arguing, crying, rebuilding, failing, trying again. It wasn't pretty. It was messy, loud, sometimes ugly, but it was theirs. "We've made so many mistakes," one of them said softly, "but we learned from them. Not because someone told us to, but because we chose to." That was the heart of it. Choice. They started digging deeper into conquered records, public ones. At first, then the encrypted fragments they'd managed to copy during their brief access to the Citadel's network. What they found chilled them. Species that joined the conquered didn't just harmonize, and they disappeared. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. Their music stopped changing. Their children stopped speaking their native tongues. Their histories were rewritten to fit the conquered's neutral narrative. Within a generation, they weren't themselves anymore. Just another quiet voice in a perfectly ordered choir. One species, the Kyril, had been poets, known across 3 sectors for their dream songs that could make stars feel alive. After joining the Concord, their archives listed them as Cultural Contributors Sector 7, no new songs in 80 years. Another, the Voss, had been engineers who built living cities that grew with their people. Now their homeworld was listed as under sustainable management. Their cities, replaced with standardized Concord habitats. It wasn't violence, it was slow erasure, and it was sold as peace. A quiet voice spoke up from the corner. If we say yes, in 50 years, will anyone on Earth even remember why we once fought for our own voice? No one answered. They didn't need to. Then came the real talk, the kind that doesn't happen in official meetings but in the dark, when the weight of the world, or galaxy, is on your shoulders. One of them, a former soldier who'd seen Earth tear itself apart before the Great Truce, leaned forward. I've watched people die for less than this, they said. Not for land or power, but for the right to say this is mine. My home. My story, my future. They weren't talking about war, not yet. But they were talking about worth. And humanity had spent centuries proving, often the hard way, that freedom wasn't free, but it was always worth protecting. Someone else brought up Earth's own past. How just a few decades ago, nations had nearly destroyed each other over resources, beliefs, borders, but instead of giving up, they'd chosen something harder: trust. They'd shared technology, opened borders, pooled knowledge. It hadn't been perfect. There were setbacks, betrayals, moments of doubt. But they kept going, because they believed deep down that people could choose better. And now, said the historian, someone wants us to hand that over like it's nothing, like our struggle, our art, our arguments, our messy, beautiful chaos, like it's just noise to be silenced. They all knew the risks. The Concord had fleets that could black out stars. They controlled trade, travel, even the flow of information. Saying no could mean isolation. Blockades, maybe worse. But saying yes? That meant losing something no war could ever take. Their soul. One of them pulled up a live feed from Earth. Not the news channels, but a public stream from a school in Mumbai. Kids were building a model of the Resolute out of scrap metal and solar panels, laughing as it wobbled on its stand. In Nairobi, a street artist was painting a mural of Earth reaching toward the stars, not with weapons, but with open hands. In Buenos Aires, musicians were playing a new song called The Answer Is Ours. That's when it hit them. They weren't just representing governments or ships or treaties. They were representing every person who'd ever looked up and dreamed. Every kid who'd asked, "What's out there?" Every elder who'd said, "Don't let them tell you who you are." They didn't need a vote. They didn't need orders. They just looked at each other and knew. We don't reject peace, the historian said, echoing words that would soon shake the galaxy. But we will not trade our soul for a seat at their table. The decision wasn't made in anger. It was made in love. For Earth, for humanity, for the messy, stubborn, brilliant thing they'd built together. They spent the next hours preparing. Not for battle, but for truth. They compiled everything. Earth's history, its failures, its triumphs, its music, its science, even its darkest hours. They didn't hide the pain. They showed it all because that was the point. Humanity wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real things grow. They change. They argue. They forgive. They try again. As the Resolute powered up for its return to the council chamber, there was no fear in the cabin. Just calm, resolve, and something else. Something the Concorde hadn't seen in a very long time. Hope. Not the kind that waits for permission, but the kind that stands up and says, "We're not done writing our story yet." And somewhere, deep in the corridors of the Citadel, a young alien clerk, born into the Concorde's perfect order, watched the humans ship through a security feed and felt something strange in their chest. A feeling they'd only read about in forbidden archives. It felt like longing. But for now, the humans didn't know that. They only knew this. They would walk back into that chamber not as beggars, not as rebels, but as equals. And if the Concord couldn't see them as such, then maybe the galaxy needed a new kind of peace, one built not on control but on respect. The engines hummed softly. Stars stretched into lines outside the window. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt wide open. Not because they had all the answers, but because they refused to let someone else write the questions. The Citadel of Accord was quieter than usual when the humans returned. Not silent, there was always the soft hum of energy conduits, the whisper of air recyclers, the distant chime of transit pods gliding through transparent tubes. But the usual calm felt tense, like the air before a storm no one dares name. The other species in the corridors slowed as the human delegation passed. Some turned away. Others watched with eyes that held something unfamiliar. Curiosity, maybe even fear. No one had ever come back to the council chamber after receiving the Concord's terms. Most species signed the protocols within hours. A few took days. None had ever walked out and returned with their heads held high. The humans didn't march. They didn't glare. They just walked, calm, steady, like people who'd made peace with a hard choice. Inside the grand chamber, the High Arbiter sat waiting, its stone-like face unreadable. Around it, the representatives of 200 species sat in perfect stillness. This was a formality, they thought. The humans had come to accept. They always did. But when the lead human stepped forward, they didn't bow. They didn't fumble with documents. They simply stood, looked out at the gathered assembly, and spoke, not with anger but with a quiet strength that carried further than shouting ever could. "We thank the Concord for its offer," they began. "We see the peace you've built. We respect the order you've kept. But we cannot accept your terms." A ripple went through the chamber. Not a sound, most species didn't gasp, but a shift in posture, a flicker of light, a tightening of limbs. The Arbiter tilted its head slightly as if adjusting its hearing. "Explain," it said, voice smooth as polished glass. The human took a breath. "You ask us to give up our colonies, our ships, our right to shape our own future. You call it harmony. But harmony isn't silence. It's not everyone singing the same note. Real harmony comes when different voices choose to sing together, freely." They paused, then continued. "We've studied your history. We've seen what happens to species who join you. Their stories fade. Their children forget their songs. Their choices are made for them in the name of peace. That's not peace. That's surrender dressed in pretty words." The chamber stayed still, but something had changed. The air felt charged like static before lightning. "We don't want war," the human said, voice softening. "We've known enough of that on Earth, but we also know this. A peace that cost you your soul isn't peace at all. It's just quiet chains." Then came the words that would echo across the galaxy. "We do not reject peace. But we will not trade our soul for a seat at your table." For a long moment, no one moved. Even the ever-present hum of the citadel seemed to hush. Then the High Arbiter spoke slower this time. "Your refusal is noted, but understand non-compliance carries consequences. You will be designated a disruptive species. Trade with Earth will cease. Your ships will be denied safe passage. Your colonies may be reassigned." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. Like saying rain is wet, the human didn't flinch. "Then let the galaxy see what happens when you punish a people for wanting to remain themselves." They turned and walked back to their group. No dramatic exit. No slamming doors. Just quiet footsteps on the glowing floor. But as they left, something unexpected happened. From the far side of the chamber, a small, insect-like delegate from the Kirill, a species whose dream songs had been silent for 80 years, lifted one delicate limb. Not in salute, not in protest, just a slight trembling raise, a gesture so small most wouldn't notice. But the humans saw it, and in that tiny motion they saw everything. Hope, memory, a spark long buried but not dead. Outside, the corridors felt different. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was full of unspoken things. A reptilian envoy from the Zenth system brushed past them, but not before slipping a data chip into the human's hand. No words, just a nod. Later, they'd find it contained encrypted logs of conquered re-education centers. Back on the Resolute, no one celebrated. But there was a new kind of energy aboard, lighter, sharper. They'd done it. They'd said no. And the galaxy had heard. As they prepared to leave orbit, a message came through. Not from the Concorde, but from a civilian freighter near the edge of Citadel space. It was short, in broken standard. "Your words reached us. Thank you." Then another, and another. From a mining outpost, a research station, a refugee transport, all saying the same thing in different ways. "We heard you. We remember." The humans didn't know it yet, but their no had done more than refuse an offer. It had reminded others that they still had a voice. The Conquered, of course, acted quickly. Official channels declared Earth non-aligned and non-compliant. Broadcasts warned other species not to engage with human vessels. Patrol ships began shadowing the Resolute as it left Citadel space. But something the Concorde hadn't counted on was this: control only works if people believe there's no other way. And now, thanks to a few humans who chose truth over safety, that belief was cracking. As the Resolute jumped to light speed heading home, one of them looked out the viewport at the shrinking dot of the Citadel. "They think they're protecting order," they said quietly, "but they're just protecting their own control." Another replied, "Maybe the galaxy doesn't need more order. Maybe it needs more courage." And somewhere on 100 worlds, beings who'd long accepted their quiet fate paused in their daily routines. They looked up at their skies, not with fear, but with a question they hadn't asked in generations. What if we said no too? The humans didn't have all the answers. They didn't even know what came next. But they knew one thing for certain. They'd rather face the unknown as themselves than live forever in someone else's dream. And that simple truth, spoken not with weapons, but with words, was already changing everything. The moment the Resolute dropped out of light speed near Earth's orbit, the crew knew things had changed. Not because of alarms or enemy ships, but because of the silence. No Concorde patrols. No official hails. Just the quiet hum of Earth's own defense grid, watching, waiting. The Concorde hadn't attacked, not yet. Instead, they'd done something colder. They'd erased Earth from the galactic map. Trade routes shut down. Data streams cut off. Human colonies on Mars and the moons of Jupiter were suddenly labeled unauthorized settlements in Concorde bulletins. Supplies stopped coming. Spare parts, medical tech, even basic comms relays gone. It was economic suffocation, slow and surgical. The message was clear: fall in line or fade away. But Earth didn't fade. Instead, something unexpected happened. While the Concorde expected panic, humanity got to work. Engineers in orbital shipyards began retrofitting old freighters with salvaged drives. Farmers in lunar domes doubled food output using open-source hydroponic designs shared freely across the net. Scientists reopened projects the Concorde had deemed non-essential, like neural interface research and atmospheric recycling, and made breakthroughs in weeks, not years. Without outside rules, creativity bloomed, not because they wanted to defy the Concorde, but because they had to rely on themselves again. And strangely, it felt familiar, like coming home. Then came the real surprise. It started with a whisper, a faint signal picked up by a deep space antenna near Titan. Not a Concorde broadcast. Not a distress call, a song. Raw, unpolished, sung in a language Earth's linguists didn't recognize. But woven into the melody were fragments of the speech the humans had given at the Citadel. Someone had heard, and they'd answered. Within days, more signals arrived. Encrypted messages hidden in cargo manifests. Poetry disguised as navigation logs. A child's drawing of Earth, sent from a mining colony 3 sectors away, tucked inside a routine supply drone that somehow drifted off course. Each one carried the same quiet message: you're not alone. The Concorde tried to clamp down. They issued warnings. They rerouted traffic. They labeled these acts cultural contamination. But you can't quarantine an idea once it's been set free. On the Cathar homeworld, workers in a Concorde-managed factory stopped their assembly lines for 10 minutes, not to protest but to stand in silence. No one spoke. No one moved. But for those 10 minutes, the machines were still. The image spread like wildfire through underground networks. On Zorath Prime, students began wearing patches stitched with a simple symbol, a circle with a single line through it. Not a weapon, just a human handprint. Security forces tore them off, but the next day, twice as many appeared. In the undercities of the hegemony, where dissent had been silent for generations, people started gathering in old data halls, sharing forbidden archives, Earth's history, its art, its messy, honest debates about right and wrong. They didn't want to become human. They just wanted to remember they could choose. Back on Earth, the United Council didn't gloat. They didn't call for war. Instead, they did something radical. They opened the vaults. Every piece of human culture, every song, every film, every scientific paper, every diary entry from wartime nurses, every failed experiment, every poem scribbled on napkins was uploaded to a public, unencrypted broadcast. No filters, no edits, just humanity, raw and real, beamed freely into the void. "We're not selling a dream," one of the broadcast engineers said. "We're showing the truth. The good, the bad, the ugly. Let them decide if it's worth fighting for." And fight they did, not with weapons, but with memory. A musician on a distant moon played a human jazz piece on a handmade flute, and thousands listened in secret. A teacher on a conquered, controlled world began ending each lesson with, "What would you choose?" A question that got them suspended, but sparked classroom debates that lasted for weeks. The conquered panicked. They called emergency sessions. They accused Earth of spreading ideological instability. They threatened sanctions on any species caught sharing human data. But the more they pushed, the more they revealed their fear. And fear, it turned out, was contagious too, but not in the way they wanted. What the Concord didn't understand was that humans hadn't won by being stronger. They'd won by being real. While the Conquered offered perfect order, Earth offered something messier but far more powerful. The right to be imperfect, to question, to grow. Even within the Conquered's own ranks, cracks appeared. Younger delegates, those who'd never known a galaxy before the Conquered, began asking uncomfortable questions. Why can't we hear the Kirill sing anymore? Why do all our cities look the same? If peace means silence, is it really peace? Older members dismissed them as naive. But the seed was planted. Meanwhile, Earth kept building. Not weapons, though they strengthened their defenses, but bridges. They sent out unarmed science vessels not to claim territory, but to share knowledge. They helped a struggling colony on the edge of known space fix their failing reactor, asking nothing in return. They translated their medical databases into 50 alien languages and broadcast them openly. It wasn't strategy. It was simply who they were. And slowly, quietly, others began to follow. A freighter captain from the Voss, whose living cities had been replaced decades ago, rerouted their ship to deliver spare parts to Mars. When questioned, they just said, "We remember what it's like to build something of your own." A data archivist on a neutral world compiled every human broadcast into a single library and left it in a public server with one note. For anyone who still believes in choice, the Concord's unity, once unshakable, began to tremble. Not from outside force, but from within. Because once people remember they have a voice, it's hard to make them silent again. And Earth? Earth just kept shining. Not with the cold light of power, but with the warm, flickering glow of 1,000 small fires, each one lit by someone who dared to say, "I choose." The galaxy was changing. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth. Freedom isn't given. It's remembered. And once remembered, it can't be unlearned. The Conquered didn't send a warning. They sent a fleet, hundreds of ships, sleek silver humming with quiet power, gathered at the edge of Sol system. Not to talk, not to negotiate, to make an example. The message was clear. Earth's defiance would end here. Either humanity would kneel, or it would be removed from the galactic stage entirely. The High Arbiter called it restoring balance. Everyone else called it what it was, the last stand of a system that feared losing control. But when the Conquered fleet arrived, they didn't find a planet bracing for war. They found something far more unsettling. Earth wasn't alone. Dozens of ships, some patched together, others ancient. A few barely spaceworthy, floated in formation between the Conquered armada and the blue-green world below. They flew no unified flag. Their designs clashed, organic curves beside jagged metal, glowing bioluminescence next to rusted hulls. But they held position, steady, silent, ready. These weren't Earth's ships. They belonged to the Kirill, the Voss, the Zorath students, the Cathar workers, the data archivists, the freighter captains who'd risked everything to say enough. Species the Conquered had long considered quiet, compliant, forgotten. They'd come. Not because Earth asked them to, but because Earth reminded them they still had a choice. The Concord commanders hesitated. This wasn't in the script. You didn't bring a fleet to crush a rebellion only to find the rebellion had become a movement. On the bridge of the lead Concord vessel, the High Arbiter watched the feed in silence. For the first time in centuries, doubt flickered in its ancient mind. How had this happened? How had one small, messy species unraveled 2,000 years of order with nothing but words and open hands? Back on Earth, there were no victory chants. No war drums, just people watching the skies, holding their breath. In cities, villages, orbital stations, everyone knew what was at stake. But no one panicked, because they'd already made their choice, and so had their new allies. Then, instead of firing, Earth did something unexpected. They opened a channel, not just to the conquered, but to every ship in the system, every listening ear across the galaxy. And they broadcast not a threat, but an invitation. "We don't want your surrender," the voice from Earth said, calm and clear. "We want your partnership, not under your rules, not under ours, but together, as equals." They laid out a simple idea, a new council, one where every species kept its voice, its culture, its right to grow, where decisions were made by consent, not command, where peace wasn't enforced, it was chosen every day by free beings. The conquered fleet stayed still. But something had shifted. On several of their own ships, junior officers exchanged glances. Some powered down their weapons, not all, but enough. Then, from the Kirill vessel, a ship shaped like a folded leaf, a single note rang out. Soft at first, then swelling, a dream song, the first in 80 years. It wasn't aimed at anyone. It was just there, beautiful, alive. One by one, other ships joined, not with weapons but with signals. A Voss engineer transmitted schematics for self-growing habitats. A Zorath student uploaded a manifesto titled "Why We Choose." A Cathar worker sent a live feed of their silent protest, now joined by thousands. The Concord's perfect order was crumbling, not from outside force but from within. Because you can't control a galaxy that remembers it's free. Faced with unity they couldn't break, and a moral high ground they couldn't ignore, the Concord fractured. Reformist delegates, many of them young, many inspired by Earth's example, seized the moment. They called for emergency sessions. They demanded transparency. They questioned the very foundation of conquered rule. Within weeks, the High Arbiter stepped down. Not overthrown, stepped down. Perhaps, it said in its final address, true harmony was never about sameness. Perhaps it was always about respect. The old Concord dissolved, not in fire but in conversation. In its place rose the Assembly of Free Peoples, a gathering not of rulers but of representatives. Each species kept its sovereignty. Each voice carried equal weight. Decisions took longer. Debates got messy. Sometimes they failed. But they were theirs. And Earth? Earth didn't claim leadership. They didn't ask for special status. They simply took their seat, not at the head of the table but among equals. Because that's all they'd ever wanted. Years later, on a quiet evening, someone asked why humanity had risked everything for a single word. No. The answer was simple. Because no is how you protect yes. You can't truly say yes to peace, to friendship, to growth, if someone else holds the pen. The galaxy wasn't perfect now. There were still disagreements, misunderstandings, moments of tension. But there was also something new, trust. Built not on fear but on the shared belief that every being deserved to shape their own story. And it all started with a small group of humans, light years from home, who looked at the most powerful alliance in the stars and politely, firmly said, "We'll find our own way." That choice didn't just save Earth. It reminded the entire galaxy what freedom really meant. Not the absence of rules, but the presence of choice. And in that choice, a new kind of peace was born. Not silent, not perfect, but alive, and sometimes that's enough.